My name is Sabrina Fernandes. I'm head of research at the Alameda Institute. Alameda is an institute based in the UK with a nucleus as well in Brazil, trying to bridge some of the gaps in knowledge and action as well regarding catastrophe and transition. This work on energy transition is something that we've been doing since our inception. It's a new institute, so we've been around since 2023, 2024, more specifically. And for the past year, we have engaged with authors in the Global North and the Global South, and with partners as well in our conversations. So it is an absolute pleasure to be joined by Amir Ledbioui, director of the Tide Center at Oxford, and Hamza Hamouchene from the Transnational Institute. And I've had the pleasure of working with both regarding conversations around green industrialization, green colonialism, so trying to understand the conflicts around the changes that are needed to fight climate change. This was one of the main objectives behind this dossier. We tried to work with more accessible language, so trying to translate scientific academic knowledge into many different pieces, different articles, and we were also really glad to feature the works of Chantal, as well as Belize Boni, Edward Bertinsky, and Thais Trindade in this process, because we also believe that art has the potential to convey a lot of knowledge that is needed to fight the crisis of our time. So after this small introduction, I want to get into the topic specifically, right? We're dealing here with the pressing issue of an energy transition. We still live in a world that, despite general acknowledgement that climate change is real, that the effects happen in any place, that they go beyond borders, we're still dealing with multiple types of denialisms. So we could have a general type of denialism. So there are some governments or some people in the industries that are always trying to say that climate change is a hoax, is not a real thing, it's something that some people made up to be able to mobilize things in their favor. But we have a very, very common type of climate change denialism, which is, it is real, it is happening, but the solution is actually a little technological adjustment here, or we can build solutions, but we have more time. We don't need to worry about this right now. We can delay the change that is needed right now and keep things about the same. So within this context specifically of fighting different types of denialism, one that is very literate and another that has to do with strategy that is needed, I'm joined here by our peers, Amir and Hamza, and maybe if you could speak from your perspective, your research work that Hamza has been doing a lot, in fact, regarding false solutions, and the work that Amir has been doing regarding the policy changes that are needed right now. How can we go beyond this really strange, happy coexistence that we have right now of expansion of renewables? We're seeing wind and solar development mainly in many areas, at the same time that we keep drilling for more oil and being told that we won't be able to move the world into an oil-free society for a really long time. Anyone want to?
First of all, thank you, Sabrina, for the invitation. Thanks for Alameda for organizing this beautiful event in this beautiful church. Really glad always to join such conversations around energy transition. In terms of your question, Sabrina, I don't think it's denialism per se anymore. I feel it's much more of an utter madness. Maybe, and that madness is not irrational per se, which is an oxymoron, and I would explain in a bit. Because the fossil fuel industry has learned from the tobacco industry from the past century. The tobacco industry spent all its time and effort and energy in denying the truth about the link between smoking and cancer. And actually, the fossil fuel industry knew that its emissions have a link with heating the planet since the 60s and 70s. I'm not denying that there are climate denialists out there within the global, economic and political elites, but I think the fossil fuel industry is smarter than this. So when their efforts in terms of suppressing the facts have come to a standstill and failed because of the scientific consensus and because of the pressures from the climate and environmental justice movement, they started adapting to the reality. And we've heard about how some fossil fuel companies started rebranding themselves as the green champions, British Petroleum suddenly said, we are beyond petroleum. Total, the French fossil fuel company said, we are Total Energies. And they started saying, we're gonna do our net zero strategies, we're gonna reduce CO2 emissions, we're gonna do renewable projects and so forth, while keeping drilling and pumping oil and gas. So the fossil fuel industry, let's say fossil capitalism, is intact. And we are seeing that those companies are becoming much more assertive in the last few years because of all the political changes that we are seeing around the world. So in 2021, just to give you a few examples, in 2021, the Saudi energy minister said, we're gonna be the last man standing and every molecule of hydrocarbon will come out, right? And we have now Trump, the president, the US president, who took the US from the Paris Agreement and who is chanting and announcing drill, baby, drill, right? And in the last few weeks, I don't know if you've seen in the news, BP announced that it will stop investing in renewable energies because it needs to expand production in oil and gas because it is much more profitable. So in the midst of that climate crisis, the intensifying climate crisis that we are seeing right now, the impacts of which are not just confined to the global south, we are seeing them even in the north, isn't this madness? But that madness has a logic to it. So it's not really irrational because it is about the unceasing compulsion to accumulate capital in the short term at whatever costs. This is how capitalism works. Basically, in 2 words, it is the profit primacy. And to be honest, when you put that climate madness in the political context around us, in the genocide in Gaza, you start, relativizing, This is just another facet of the imperialist capitalist system that is in crisis, a system that produces death and destruction.
In a few words, there's this normalization continues, and there's some level of cynicism coming from the fossil fuel industry right now as well, because when it was convenient for them to put themselves as now we're going to this general energy direction. Total Energies, I think, is a really great example because if you look into their marketing, it's almost like rainbow looking, all of these different colors. And then you have the rainbow colors for a petroleum platform, for a green hydrogen plant, for the solar farm. And at the same time, when it's really necessary, when there are geopolitical changes that make it convenient for you to go back to this oil standard, they're willing to do that as well. And that's a huge challenge when you're talking about governments that are thinking green. They're saying, well, we do want green industrial policy, but they really don't want to end the subsidies for the old types of industries, right?
Thank you, Sabrina. You asked the right questions, and I agree with what Hamza has said, though I wonder if it's logic madness or if it's mad logic. And but actually on that point, there is one of my interests is on bio-inspiration and biomimicry. And especially sitting here in this beautiful church makes you really wonder about, the humans as a species, within this broader ecosystem that arrives, and our custodianship on Earth, but also what is to be learned from other species. And there's something in which what you described, which reminds me of ants. So ants, as you might know, are extremely smart species, especially in terms of their collective intelligence and the way they get organized as a colony. But there's something with ants when they move the colony from A to B. They always follow, right, the ants in front of them. So they all move as a pack, right? No one is lost. But if the front row of the ants sees, for some reason, if they're turning, but they see the last row of the colony, they'll immediately follow them, right? And then they go in circles, and it actually leads to circles of exhaustions until the death of the whole colony, because they just keep going around in circle until basically they're completely exhausted, right, to death. And in some ways, that might be this kind of moment, what we're seeing, where you're just following the trend, you just kind of, and we know that this is not logic, or as you said, it's mad, but we still keep doing the same thing. And it's the definition of folly, right, of madness, is that you know that you keep repeating what doesn't work. So how to break this? And, Sabrina, again, you ask the right questions, and even, your work broadly helps seeing things in a ecosystemic way. But I suppose the one thing I'll say there is about the perceptions of winners and losers. And I wonder whether you might challenge my view on this, but I think that one of the, I don't know if it's a mistake or omission, is that we perhaps have not enough engaged with who would be the losers of this transition, especially the powerful one. And the issue is, how powerful are the losers, right? If they're not powerful, then, you can bypass them. But if they're that powerful, and as you said, they're really well organized, they're smart, they have a lot of influence, lobbying, then there must be a different way to engage to find a credible target. By the way, speaking about the influence of fossil fuel lobbies, can you guess who funded the first environmental campaign shedding light on the impact of aviation on emissions? Take a guess. Exxon? What? Boeing? It's BP that you mentioned, right? Because for them, this was a great way to shed attention away from energy companies to individual consumers, right? If you've been traveling, well, you're also responsible for air travel. And they've actually also funded the research for coming up with the idea of carbon footprint. Because the idea is, once you have a carbon footprint, you can measure it at the individual level, and it shifts responsibilities from energy companies to individuals, because they can say, oh, well, look, your carbon footprint is, 3 tons per year or whatever. And therefore, everybody suddenly has a responsibility and less inclined to point fingers at energy companies. So as you said, it's a really powerful lobby. And at least something that we're working on at the Tide Center is focusing on national oil companies. So what you said in terms of the reframing, it's bad if it's hypocritical, but in a way, in the kind of low carbon future, it's supposed to happen, right? But it's supposed to be meant. So, no, my point, and that's where I'll end and link to the rest of the conversation, is we need to really pay attention to the losers and making sure that the powerful ones have an incentive to work with us, but that the weakest ones, and especially when it comes to people that are at risk of losing their livelihoods out of global decarbonization, which is something that will happen, that are actually supported and part of the solution. Because as you often say, the energy transition has to be just, or it will just not be. Thank you.
So on this point, Amir mentioned the aviation. We actually, in the introduction, I bring in some very interesting data that a lot of people, when we're talking about carbon footprint or emissions, and we're talking about commercial aviation, which is a very smart way of saying you're responsible as an individual, not as a society, don't know that the concrete industry actually emits a lot more a lot more than commercial aviation. But the concrete industry is embedded in so much, right? So it's real estate development. They benefit a lot from war, because if you destroy things, you have to rebuild things. And you just put this into all of your infrastructure plans. So you're not planning infrastructure for efficiency, but it's about building more and more and more. So this way of thinking is exactly the opposite of ecosystemic thinking. So this work on biomimicry, learning from nature. If there's one thing that we realize is that there's a term that we use, we talk about a metabolic rift or a metabolic fracture. Something's broken in society, and it's actually, when we're talking about visceral ecologies, right, Chantal, like this is communicating that something is broken, but we keep breaking it more and more when we're talking about solutions. When it comes to climate change, when it comes to emissions, this leads into a really dangerous bias in how we're promoting politics. This bias, we refer to it sometimes as carbon tunnel vision, right? So you have a tunnel vision, you're looking in this specific direction, we're not looking around it. And then you're missing the loss of biodiversity, you're missing air pollution, you're missing the issue with plastics. And if you're doing this, you're actually detaching a piece of nature in a very artificial way, which is part of the problem of how we got here in the first place. So when we're discussing these matters around the carbon tunnel vision, we do realize that there has been a tendency of talking about energy transition as if it's the only thing that we need to do. That's the one thing that we're going to fix. We're going to either perpetuate the carbon, the fossil fuel industry by using technologies like carbon capture and storage, for example, or we're just, okay, we're not going to do this much, especially for countries where they don't rely on fossil fuels for their income, for royalties, for their GDP. Well, okay, now we're going to do the green oil. Might be green hydrogen, might be we're going to extract more lithium because it's what we have in our resources. And then the impacts on communities and the impacts on nature, the ecosystems, they're treated as collateral damage. It's just part of the process. It's not as important. This can be seen locally, but also globally. Globally, in the tendency of shifting the bad impact somewhere else. The externality is never ours. We see this a lot in terms of residues, right? Like residue management. It's something that you teach people to recycle in one place, but not to reduce their impact. Keep buying. Buying is good. It's really important. We need your consumption. The consumption, it's going to make the world go around. And then you just recycle it. And then you do your job. You put your things in the right bins. They get taken somewhere else, and then you never hear about it again. And then you have these huge shipments from residues, from recycling. They're being taken into industries normally in the global south, and they're the ones who have to deal with that. The same tendency can be seen when we're talking about energy, and the same tendency can be seen when we're talking about our approach to nature in general. So what are perspectives that you find can be useful for us to avoid this carbon tunnel vision, for us to have this more holistic way of thinking about nature? This is one of the reasons I prefer talking about ecology rather than the environment. Usually there's this tendency of seeing that, okay, we're here and the environment is out there. Nature is when you walk through a park, when you go to the woods, when you go hiking. When nature is actually all around us. Everything here is made of nature. We are part of nature. So having this integration, being part of nature, having an ecological thinking, avoiding the carbon tunnel vision is perhaps one of the strategic learnings that we have in the types of politics that we want to create, no?
No, thanks, Sabrina. And actually, what you just said reminds me that I really hate, so I'll speak up. I hate the concept of the bioeconomy, which has become very popular these days, but it's the idea, the definition is very blurry, it's very fuzzy. It encompasses so many things, right? And now it's working better. But actually, everything is bioeconomy. Everything that we use, even the plastics that we use, technically, everything comes from nature with different degrees of transformation. But it kind of silos the whole conversation about nature and economy within that concept of the bioeconomy sector and not the rest. But I completely agree on how to do that. Well, now there is the rise of all these different methodologies of life cycle analysis and so on, but it hasn't permeated yet into people's minds and psyches, and also pedagogy, right? Teaching kids already at young age, right? That these are all the different impacts on nature. These are all the different stresses that exist, ecological stresses that we should be worried about. And in a way, the more that this is really ingrained in terms of how we learn about the environment, the more, our communities will really learn to pay attention, right, to what is happening and go beyond easy solutions. And what you're describing, the victims at the moment are communities in the global south, because this is where material waste is actually being dumped. There are many, many cases. We can go into this if you're interested in that, but a lot of that waste, is actually shipped to different places. Well, in Chile, there are big cases of textile dumping in Ivory Coast. So it's kind of putting literally things under the carpet, right? So we must do better as a society, and we must find solutions that won't come and essentially bite us. And the last thing to say on that point is those ecological responsibilities, something that is not yet enough stressed in discussions in the global agenda, is the fact that ecological priorities are highly time and space specific. And so in the UK, for example, the issue of greenhouse gas emissions might be at in the priority of communities and the government. But in places like Namibia, it might not have to do anything with emissions, but more with water scarcity, right? And therefore, those solutions don't easily translate there. And this is a nice segue to your work, Hamza, on water scarcity and green hydrogen.
Oh, thanks, Amir, and thanks, Sabrina, for asking the right questions. I think that we need to challenge. Do you hear me well? You do? Yeah. Challenge and deconstruct that carbon tunnel vision, for sure. For me, the discussion around just transition cannot be reduced to just two matters of energy and climate, and they cannot also be reduced to technical matters of carbon and energy. A just transition should involve a radical socio-economic and ecological transformation of our societies. I think we need to move from those extractivist, destructive economic models to models that value and respect humans and nature and let them flourish. For me, that vision should be eco-socialism. That's what I believe in. But that just transition towards eco-socialism, I see it as a revolutionary project that needs a kind of rethinking of the way that we produce and consume things, a rethinking of our relations between each other. Right now, those relations are primarily shaped by labor exploitation, by racial discrimination, by gender oppression, but also a rethinking of our relations to nature. Nature under capitalism has been seen as that thing that needs to be dominated, commodified to make a profit, but also at the end, a kind of a sink for waste, a waste sink. But the global ruling classes, or the capitalists of this world, would like us to believe that we can resolve the ecological and climate crisis by, some simple technical operations. And those technical operations you mentioned could be, carbon capture and sequestrations, and I'll come back to that. And that belief is called, I think it's an oversized techno-optimism. But I think it's much more a techno delusion, to be honest. Because those technologies are being put forward as those miraculous solutions that will resolve the climate crisis in the near future. That's what they tell us. Technology will develop in a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades, and we will find the solutions. Let's just maintain the status quo. Let's not change anything. Let's keep pumping, and everything will be fine. But it's not. Technology, of course, is gonna play a role, but it's no substitute for urgent, radical measures of keeping the oil in the ground and not embarking on any new fossil fuel projects, either pumping, drilling, or building infrastructure. We talk about carbon capture and sequestrations, and I believe the UK is putting a lot of money into that technology. First of all, it's still ineffective, still not at scale, and still, is not really reducing, and it's very, very expensive, and not reducing the CO2 emissions. And who's pushing for that? Fossil fuel industry, because they want to keep maintaining their own operations. And the same story with the false solutions that have been promoted in the climate talks for a long time by the corporate sectors. They call them the carbon markets. You can sell and buy carbon offsets, carbon credits, carbon permits, which are really just another euphemism for pollution permits, because they have been proven to be ineffective, fraudulent. There are a lot of those mechanisms that are fraudulent. They are not doing what they are supposed to do, but also end up creating more injustices and more other problems in terms of green grabs, displacing local and indigenous communities in the name of conservation. So these are false solutions that we need to abandon. We need radical climate actions yesterday. But, our ruling elites are not listening.
It's very interesting because they found that moving to the topic of negotiations and internationalism, because we talked about Global North and Global South, but this year we're going to host the COP30 in Brazil, in Belém, Brazil, my country. I was here in the UK a while back when the COP was in Glasgow, and it seems like the conversation is still about the same. We change a little bit the terms of what we're discussing. We're talking about loss and damage, how much, are we going to get a green fund for it, who's going to finance it? And it's always, the result is always underwhelming. It's way below what we're asking. What happened in Baku last year is a proof of this. In the meantime, carbon credits are still there in the pavilions. When we visit the part of the negotiations, they're still talking about this as a normal thing, even though there is enough proof around the fraud. And also double accounting, when they come in and they say, okay, we're protecting this area of forest, and now you can buy the credits from the emissions that are being absorbed because of this forest, but the forest was there from before. So how are you going to offset new emissions from something that was there from before? So this is what we refer to as double accounting in the carbon credit process. And this is so normalized that it's clouding the thinking around these solutions, and how to better communicate as well the benefits of transition. And I'll give a very simple example. We have in the dossier conversation that I had with Lala Penharanda, who's one of the coordinators for the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy project. And it's about working with people who may fear losing their jobs, losing their livelihoods because of transition. So we want to support oil workers. We don't want to support the oil industry. There's a huge difference here. And often there's a huge focus on retraining people. And from the policymaker perspective, it's just simple, right? You teach people how to do something else, and then you move them into another job. That's tiresome. Getting more training, getting adjusted to a new job. But there's very little discussion about, for example, early retirement. which might be something that workers will be willing to do, because that means securing, like they're already coming from a job that they may be tired of, and they want to retire, especially with perspectives where, like in many places, retirement is not so easy anymore. There's an erosion of pension funds. So there could be other incentives given to people that are not usually the main thing on the table. And we need to ensure that we're bringing that into the conversation whenever we're discussing a just transition. There is something from Hamza, from the book on green colonialism in the Arab region, when you talk about the just transition is not going to look the same everywhere. There's not one model. I can't come out here with a blueprint and then we go, okay, in England, it's this, and then we're going to just follow all of these directives step by step and apply that in Portugal, and then apply that in Algeria, then in South Africa, then in Brazil, and then in China. We're talking about vastly different material conditions. The economic system is different. The security of labor is different. The level of industrialization, and also even the emissions, right? So the emissions in certain places may be much more related to loss of forest cover from land use change, from the very, very impressive role of industrial agribusiness and production of animal exploitation at a large scale, rather than oil per se. So in this very difficult job of getting people together and also trying to negotiate, trying to set standards, agreements, even understanding that the Paris Agreement that we all use as a landmark, as something that, as a benchmark as well, right? That's something that we're measuring ourselves against. When it was signed, it was already pretty much late. The 1.5 and the 2.0 degree, we already knew that we should be trying for even harder, but in the negotiations, we were told that we had to settle for less. Yet we still keep using the Paris Agreement as if it's our main benchmark, rather than, okay, let's go further now. Let's try to do better this time. So regarding these challenges, what do you think could be ways of getting people to understand these benefits of working together, in the sense of making sure that we're not promoting a just transition project here that comes at the cost of communities and ecosystems in another place, and understanding that it's not enough to just get people to sit together and negotiate if they didn't even get their house in order, like we were discussing around coordination before, right, Amir? So if you can make some comments around that, I think that would be beneficial. Who wants to go out?
No, you said something, I think, really good and precise. Just transition will look different in different places. But at the same time, that transition cannot happen in one place at the expense of another. Cannot happen with certain people, rich and maybe different looking people, at the expense of other people. And in that respect, that just transition framework and project that needs to take into account the historic and ongoing global inequalities, and also the colonial and imperial hierarchies in this world. So the people and the peripheries of this world, the global south, that has been sacrificed under, let's say, the fossil fuel regime of accumulation, cannot be made sacrificial people and bodies again in the name of sustainability and the green transition. Really, we cannot allow for the reproduction of extractivist and neo-colonial dynamics that some of us call green grabbing, green extractivism, and green neo-colonialism. And there are many examples that show that that green transition that they are talking about is not really going in the right direction. And that's why I use a lot the framework of green colonialism, specifically from the context of North Africa and the Arab region, looking at those renewable energy projects that they are telling us about. So many projects are being devised to safeguard, for example, the EU energy security and for the EU to reach its own targets, climate targets. It's always the priority. So you find a lot of export-oriented projects to export renewable energy, to export green electricity, to export green hydrogen, without, taking into account what happens around those communities, what happens to the lands of those communities, what happens to the resources of those communities. So there is this big project, I think, which is maybe will sound and have an echo here, called X-Links. So this is an ex-Tesco CEO who came up with this idea in 2021. I read it in Bloomberg at the time. That was during the time of the pandemic. I didn't believe it. It was a huge project. $22 billion. They want to build big solar plants and wind farms in southern Morocco, and then construct an undersea cable from southern Morocco that would take the green electricity to Devon, so they can feed the homes of around 8 million people in the UK. At first, I didn't believe it. A year later, they added a sentence in the UK Energy Security Strategy document saying it is being considered. A year later, the energy minister at the time said, we are really considering that project. So you may say, what's wrong with sharing electricity and exporting? That's trade. That has been there for centuries and millennia. So what is wrong in that? I will tell you what is wrong. First of all, these projects need a lot of land. So one of those projects necessitates to produce, for example, green hydrogen for export to Germany and other European countries, necessitates around 180,000 hectares of land. That's more than the size of the Greater London area. I had to compare it to see what's happening there. And they're gonna tell you the land is empty, nobody is there, that Orientalist and colonial environmental narrative again. But then we look at the local political economy of Morocco. Electricity, they generate most of their electricity, 80% of their electricity, from imported fossil fuels. So isn't the priority to build those projects, to reach self-sufficiency in your own country, to green your grid, to provide cheap green electricity? And then when you have excess, you can export. But capital does not think that way. And many projects have been built without even the approval of the pastoralist communities who live there. Like Ouarzazate solar plant is one of the biggest solar plants in the world. It's a green grab. The land has been confiscated from the local communities without a proper consultation process. The same story with green hydrogen that is being put forward there as a replacement of gas, that miraculous solution that we're gonna use it in, shipping industry, in aviation, in cars, and even in heating. I grant it, green hydrogen will play a role, but not necessarily the role that is being put out there. Especially that green hydrogen needs, first of all, the generation of green electricity, so using the capacities of the countries, and then needs desalinated water. And countries like Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and Egypt, Mauritania face repeated water stress. So isn't the priority to build those desalination plants for local usage, for drinking water and agriculture? But, always those corporate sectors and capital work in a different way. You were mentioning critical raw minerals as well. And it's the same story. If we're gonna continue like in the same way of producing and consuming things, we're gonna need much more extraction, which means many sacrifice zones in the name of sustainability, or maybe we can call them green sacrifice zones. So for me, I think the way forward, first of all, we need to challenge those projects. We need really to deconstruct them, to show their impacts. And Amir said something very important at the start. The winners and losers. We need to highlight what happens to the losers of that transition. Are they really part of it? Are they shaping it? Are they embracing it? Are they benefiting from it? And then we need to ask, like, who owns, those projects, and who gets to decide? But then that needs to have, combined strategies. I feel true decolonization and true sovereignty, popular and national sovereignty in the South, but also, kind of a degrowth in the North, degrowing the socially unnecessary, excessive, lifestyle of the richest amongst us, what some people call, the imperial mode of living. So I think these needs to be combined, and at the heart of it, we need climate reparations, we need colonial reparations, and I think the movements are starting to grapple with these issues.
Thank you. Yeah, to answer those questions, I'd like to bring up the idea of exercising our democratic right. Because what's happening with energy, and especially now hearing you talk, is actually very similar to the discipline of economics or even medical studies, as I heard, where, it's often said that you have to leave those complicated topics to the experts, right? Because it's really complex, and most people, and the language is very convoluted. But, most terms in economics are extremely easy to explain, but hidden under unnecessarily complicated terms, right? But this also sometimes is a way to, for the experts to be the only ones, to have a say, right? And there are some of those decisions have a huge impact on people's lives. I mean, quantitative easing. Can there not be a more complicated way to say printing money, right? And people can actually relate to that. They understand the implications. I once complained about this to a medical doctor who told me, no, don't worry. It's not just in economics. We do that too. We have this really complicated Latin term to say like hypertension or dehydration. But that's otherwise, it kind of, it brings this idea that, the experts know better. But in energy, it's actually very similar, right? You often hear that, oh, it's really complex, and energy systems and temporality and whatever. But actually, a lot of it can be boiled down to, really easy to understand decisions that impact people. And in fact, the more communities have a say in those decisions, the less it opens door for powerful lobbies to design it in the way that they want to. And this is why I also really like the work of Brett Christophers, and that relates to your point on profits, who show, I think most of us have heard that the price of renewables have been dramatically falling over the years, right? Now in most of the world, solar-based electricity is actually cheaper than fossil fuel-based electricity, which begs the question, so why is this still an issue, right? And the issue has to do with profits. It's cheaper to produce electricity with solar today, but it's not as good as a business, right, than extracting fossil fuels. So the expected profitability is lower in solar. This calls for societal discussions on how you want to organize this, right? And in some countries, it's still worth it to have it through public investment, right? Because the benefits, right, for society as a whole, even economically, outweigh, right, the differential in profits that you would have between solar and energy and fossil fuels. And that really shows that we need more people to be involved in those discussions, and it takes a societal efforts in schools, right? For kids to actually grow with the confidence that they can actually have a say in those complicated issues, right? That they can learn if there are issues to be learned, and it's not something that has to be stuck in the COP negotiations. The only one time I've been to a COP, it was the Biodiversity COP, and I had met a delegation from a country that I won't mention because it's recorded, an African country, and they were basically saying, Amir, we are lost. Those terms are so technical, right? And these are diplomats. They cannot contribute to the discussion. They can barely understand what is being said because it's in language that is so convoluted, right? That it's hard for people to actually have a say in what is said. So it's not just governments, trade unions, schools, but again, since we are in a beautiful church, it also has to do with theology, religious communities, to bring lights on this kind of ecosystemic way of thinking. And I do believe that this is something that religion has to offer, right? that is often missing from the discourse. This idea of nature as God's creation. These are things that you find in Christianity, in Buddhism, in Judaism, in Islam as well, where there's a clear emphasis that humans are not sovereigns on earth, but they're custodians. And custody implies protection, right? And it implies a way to interact with the natural world that is really at the complete opposite than what is being done today. So whatever works, whatever platforms get people, engaged and excited about action, I think is really needed. And we've pointed out some of the bad things, and we've been quite pessimistic, but it's important to bring optimism in terms of the individual actions that can lead to greater change.
All right, let's talk optimism then, because it's necessary. Usually when we're talking about the climate crisis, the ecological collapse, is really easy to get into pessimistic mode and only see catastrophe in front of us. I'm very guilty of that, by the way. I do that all the time. But it's a good opportunity to call to attention at the end of the dossier, one of the artworks that we have by this Brazilian artist, Thais Trindade. I actually have this one on my wall at home. And it's the past and present foretell the future. You can see it right at the end of the dossier. I love it. It's really beautiful because there's this connection with a tree and how you have these roots and the tree is building up. And for me, it's really about these teachings from the past and the material conditions that we have today. So we do have a contradiction. We do know that we need to be at peace with nature and that we are part of nature. Indigenous knowledge that we still retain today because we still have indigenous survivors from all of the indigenous genocide and displacement and ethnic cleansing. We have these teachings. But the material conditions that we're facing today, they're very tough, to say the least. So what can we do? What are we learning right now? What are the perspectives that we have that can push us forward? Thinking of this, we have, for example, a piece here in the dossier by Julia Holanda on community alternatives to solar management and the distribution of energy from an energy sovereignty perspective. We have a piece with Breno Bringo talking about eco-territorial ways of understanding society. And something that I do learn a lot, because even though I've been doing work on energy transition for a really long time, this understanding that we cannot isolate ourselves. I've also been doing a lot of work on food sovereignty. And with Alameda, Benjamin Fogel, who's here as well, my co-editor, also worked on a dossier last year on food sovereignty with Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in South Africa, partnership with Alameda on that. And something that we do understand is that agroecology has a lot to teach us. And there's been a lot of good things coming from that. The largest social movement in Latin America, which is the landless workers movement, is also one of the largest producers of organic rice, which is a staple in our region. So we know it is possible to produce without toxic agrochemicals in our food. We know that it is possible to grow food in forest environments, so we don't need to deforest and just have monocrops. We also know that it's possible to do that, ensuring that the people working the land are making a good living, that are healthy, that they're also better protected from extreme weather events, because you do create climate resilience. When we live in cities and we have more green space, this is not just for the benefit because we think a park is beautiful and we want to take our children strolling through the park. But that's also protecting us if we're having lots of rain, and then we won't be subject to heavy flooding. So having this interconnected way of thinking is a good way to shape our understanding of the time that we have wasted, but the time that we can actually recuperate. The idea of reparations has to do with a lot of that too. I believe this idea that we can use a just perspective to give back to those that can actually benefit us even more so. Because if we do have a lot of forests still standing on the planet, it's because traditional communities, despite all of the violence, have been taking care of it. So we don't say about like, oh, let's value their knowledge because there's a convention from the International Labor Organization that say previous consultation is really important. No, it's because they do know what we're doing, and we need to emphasize that we can't just extract that knowledge. It comes with people, and those people need to be at the center of the conversation here. And it's also part of why on the cover here, and this is a cover that Belize Boni and Thais Trindade worked together on here, we have sort of like the midnight clock, right? So this idea that we are fighting, some people really want to take us into catastrophe through this old way of thinking of development, which I believe is false. These industries that continue to be so profitable that when you're like economies always talking about discount rates and, you know, the interest, but it only makes sense to translate this as they only think about short-term profit. They're not thinking about whether we're able to keep going for 30 years, 50 years, or as I played with it in a previous piece, nobody's thinking about the next century. It's just about the short time kind of thinking. And when one of the big guys come out thinking about, oh, long term, is actually in terms of space colonialism and ensuring that you go into techno-feudalism. So this idea that they hold all of the resources and people just have to play along with it, like Elon Musk, who's in the US government now, usually promotes. So we need to be the ones to say that we have the answer for the future. What kind of future we're capable of imagining here. And in terms of imagination, I'm going to challenge the two of you to give us a glimpse of what you think society should look like. Yes, I did not prepare you for that at all. So, yeah, that would be a great conversation at the end, but what do you think society should look like? And I try to work with this exercise a lot because it is a really good way of convincing people that the ecological transition makes sense because it is ultimately about a good life for everyone. So what is a good life to you? What is the transition that we're moving into? Because it's not just about decarbonization, it's about making sure that we're not just surviving on this planet, but we're actually thriving, no?
I'm gonna cheat. I'm not gonna answer the question in a direct way. So I'm gonna do because I don't believe there is one answer or right answer to that. I feel you need to start with a kind of an analysis of our predicament, a critical analysis of our predicament to see through the deceptions, the lies of the mainstream discourse, but at the same time, continue mobilizing resistance and organizing communities and workers around injustices within the framework of an emancipatory future. Because I don't believe that people are passive victims. Those projects that I mentioned, people resist them. Even maybe they get crushed, but they resist them. They express their dissent. They express a different way of doing things. What I believe that we should be doing is, first of all, to stop having a blind faith and belief in our ruling classes that they're gonna resolve the climate crisis. They've been talking for 30 years. 30 years. Every year in climate summit, we're gonna say we address the climate crisis, we're gonna reduce the CO2 emissions, but it's just blah, blah, blah. As Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish climate activists have described them. Those climate talks have failed and bankrupt, and we need to move beyond those, organize much more outside. Because our issues or the problems that we are facing are related to the imperialist capitalist system. So they are systemic. And we need to organize against them in a systemic way. So we need to start connecting the dots between various issues, connecting our struggles, not just at the local and national level, but also at the global and regional level. And I think that's very important. And I get always reminded when I talk about the COPs of the Colombian President Petro. He made a speech at the climate talks in the Emirates. That was December 2023. And he linked the genocide that is taking place in Palestine with the climate crisis. So we see the intersectionality of our struggles. He said the genocide and the barbaric acts that are being committed against the Palestinian people is what await the millions of people fleeing the south because of the climate crisis. He said, you know, Gaza is the rehearsal of the future. And he's absolutely right. If we do not organize vigorously and, you know, fight that system of death and destructions, because the global ruling elites are not just willing, actually they are already sacrificing millions of black and brown people, as well as poor white working class people, so they can continue like maintaining their profits, amassing their wealth and their domination. And they are already doing it. Like we see how they are treating the migrants, letting them drown. And we've seen it clearly also in the last climate talks. I was in Azerbaijan, in Baku, last November. And the global, like the richest countries on this earth, basically the Western countries, basically reneged on their commitment, on the climate commitments, to save the planets, while at the same time continuing to fund the genocide, you know, fueling wars, rearming. Now we hear rearmament in the European Union and in the UK, while cutting social welfare. I think we definitely can do better than this. Definitely we can do better than this. And you're right when you say it should have been done yesterday. We have no time to lose. I think we have a war to win, but it's a matter of keeping organizing at every level and occupying every space that we have. Because if we leave it to our ruling classes, we are going into the abyss. That's not a hopeful note, but I believe in people, in their creativity. That's what happened in the previous centuries when people resisted colonialism in even my home country. French colonialism stayed 132 years, but we ended up expelling them. And the struggle continues. So people do not give up. And I think we shouldn't give up. We need to maintain the pressure and organize even more.
Thanks, Hamza. So I think the optimism job is left to you, Amir. I'm sorry.
That's a tough job. So I think that we're faced, so climate change is the ultimate civilizational test. No? Because if we are, and if you are religious, this is kind of a divine test for humanity and its resilience and its ability to come together in the face of a common threat and a common challenge. And in a way, if we are to solve climate change, the challenge is actually much greater than, as you both highlighted, it's not just an ecological solution or tech solution. It has to bring together people from different backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, skin color, culture, religion, and actually come up with a credible and realistic target, right? And everybody has to be part of that effort. And this is where I'm somehow hopeful, even though the directions are not, because we have to, in a way. And one of the things in terms of the ideal society, I might disagree a bit with you on the degrowth side. I'm not a degrower, but there is an issue of excess, right? In many ways that has to be addressed. whether that's degrowth or no. And I think that's part of quantifying the good life. What is the good life? And it doesn't have to be always more and more, but what do actually people want, right? And without having to feel that we always need more. And on that front, in terms of what the ideal system looks like, is in a system where, as humanity, we're able to detect where are the stresses on specific ecological ecosystems and address them. For example, rich nations have a responsibility, but let's say the uncomfortable truth is that most of the growth in emissions, right, in relative terms, in the next few decades, or the century, to take the long-term approach, Sabrina, will be in developing nations, right? Countries like India, countries like Bangladesh, Nigeria, where you're expecting some of the most growth in population, but also that are highly carbon-intensive societies. Now, it's not their responsibility alone, because they haven't contributed to greenhouse gas emissions historically. But here, if you're thinking about European countries, if you're actually really, even if you reach a stage where you really want to reduce your emissions, right, you also have to finance these countries, right, to have better incentives to go green. Because if they don't, you're still not solving the solution. So it's everybody's part of the solution, right? And the responsibilities of the UK, for example, are not within the UK borders, and it might have more ecological impact to support developing countries go green, but truly support them, not in the current way, which is actually with increasingly, sorry, I'm going to use what economists like to do, that complicated terms, but the cost of capital for renewable energy is basically what it costs to invest in renewable energy projects in Africa is much, much, much higher, right, than what it costs in Europe. And that's because of the expected profit or the interest that lenders expect from lending for those projects in Africa compared to Europe, right? This is not a system that incentivizes African governments to actually push the green agenda. So really rethinking different responsibilities by different nations and thinking as a world, as a species, I think that's what I see as something to go forward, so that we don't become an invasive species that damages just everyone else and all other species and doesn't care, but actually one that lives in symbiosis with the rest of our planet.
Thank you. And I invite you to read the dossier. I invite you to reflect upon the artwork that we featured in the dossier as well. And together we can come up with better solutions. Together we can think of transitions in ways that are internationally just, but also that is not just about the work right now, but actually building a better, sustainable, long-lasting, hopefully, future for all of us. Thank you. And now we open for questions, commentary, or like whatever you'd like to say as well, because it's part of a dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm the vicar here, and just want to thank you so much for all your input. I've never had the opportunity to thank two Algerians for your hospitality. They probably before you were born, actually, either of you. I spent a year working in Algeria in the early 1980s, and it was the most amazing experience. So thank you for your hospitality. I also just want to wonder about about the difference between optimism and hope. And I'm not sure we can be terribly optimistic about the journey that we're on at the moment. But I think as people of faith, we need to constantly have hope that there is something different around the corner. And I wonder whether the Japanese art of kintsugi, you've heard of that? Yeah. And the notion, if you've not, it's when a piece of artwork, a ceramic pot breaks into thousands of pieces, it's stitched together again by gold leaf. So it becomes more beautiful or differently beautiful than it was before. But it's also stitched together by something that's really very precious and very expensive. And I think there's a theological underpinning of that sense of, in the end, this will be fixed by love, and the love that we have for one another, the love that we have for our neighbour, whether that's around the corner or around the world. No.
I can ask a question. Actually, a couple. Why not? One thing, when you discussed green colonialism and the situation in the global south, I wonder if you could address a little bit whether you think that the current policies being or the current chaos being unleashed in the United States by the current government and the, say, aggravation of geopolitical tensions, does this, in your view, simply unleash the rich countries to engage again in green colonialism? Or do you think actually the geopolitical tensions may create a space for the global south countries to have, say, more leverage in charting their own routes? So this is one. And the second one, there was some implicit discussion amongst you on degrowth. And I think in our tribes in the left, this debate between degrowth and ecological modernism is taking place very strongly. So if you could talk a little bit about that, I think it would be interesting.
Thank you. If I may, can I hijack talking about degrowth? Yeah. So I've been working for a while with the idea that because it's scary to talk about degrowth to a lot of people, because to people it may sound like the opposite of growth is a recession or maybe a depression, and we know that looks bad. People lose their jobs. We don't have enough funding for a welfare state, for public resources, increasing inequality and poverty. But not every growth is good, and I think this is the main point. We need to qualify it. And I always use the example of cancer, right? Tomorrow's growth is bad, so we would like to degrow it. We would like to phase it out. We would like to eliminate it. And this is how I think about the fossil fuel industry, for example. In terms of policy making, perhaps it might be more agreeable to people to see it as selective degrowth. If we are going to make a transition, and this is one of the points that I try to highlight all the time, transition is not going to be about the coexistence of the old and the new. It is about doing away with these old perspectives, this old industry, this old way of exploiting resources to make room for something else. So it can't be endless expansion, because we know that leads us into collapse. Even the more mainstream policymakers, they talk about limits to growth in terms of planetary scale. They understand that we are pushing planetary boundaries. That type of language is present there, but they are afraid of the word degrowth. Sometimes they really emphasize that, no, but growth is good. We know growth is necessary. Let's talk about what kind of growth. I want the growth of agroecology in the way that we plan our food system internationally, not just in one place. I absolutely want the growth of renewables, but I want to make sure that when lithium is being extracted in the Southern Triangle, lithium in South America, we have energy democracy principles in place to ensure that the people who are suffering from energy sovereignty, I mean, in the south of Chile, some people are still like having to burn wood. But there's a huge plan for a green hydrogen plant so we can export green hydrogen to Germany. And mind that they don't even know how they're going to do that, because technologically transporting green hydrogen in that direction and for that distance is literally explosive, right? So we need to be able to translate that language to people. I do believe that most of the people doing serious work on degrowth are able to do that, but we do have some myths, we have some misunderstandings. There is a tendency to sometimes mischaracterize degrowth and to put words in the mouth of somebody else and saying, oh no, but what they're saying is really bad for workers. But when we do have this exercise of conveying what we see society like, and when Uli Brand and Marcus Wiesen are talking about the imperial mode of living, they do propose a solidaristic mode of living as something else. So this exercise of saying, we are going to degrow this so we can grow something else, and thinking about like selecting things, choosing, giving ourselves back the choice of saying we want our city to be like this. We want more public transportation. You want it to be free, but we know that if it's free, it's not enough if we're not rearranging. The city should be more walkable, to have better bus lanes, that the bus is running 24 hours, that the places that you can go are well lit, that it's safe for women and children to come and go. So this is about this very interconnected metabolic way of thinking. And there's a way of communicating it, and I think sometimes we do get lost in this not very fruitful conversation anymore between degrowth versus ecological modernism, because I don't think it's one or the other. It's usually a perspective that poses development and modern ways of thinking and industry as something that's opposite of what the serious degrowth proponents are saying. But I think most of the degrowth proponents that I know do very good work on industrialization. They do think that's important for you to be able to access goods and services. But what kind of industry? What for? What kind of jobs? How secure, how well paid they are? And what is a public pathway that can be built as well? And I have a very good friend of mine, Daniel Aldana Cohen, in the US. He talks about investing in public luxuries, which I think is a really beautiful way of thinking what we want to do. Luxury is usually something that you think of, the rich and the famous, the big elites, and it's something usually very decadent from our perspective, right? These big yachts and private jets, and this way of living that a lot of people on social media are scrolling and liking and secretly wishing they wanted to be there, but it's never going to be reached by most of the people. Public luxuries can be reached. They are within reach, especially if we're doing the planning, the conversation together with people and reimagining societies. And I think the growth can be a very useful tactic in this process. I don't think of it as the end goal. I don't want to go into a degrowth society. I want to go into a society of a good life that has been radically transformed through an eco-social basis. But the growth is a very important tool, in my perspective, for us to think about where we go next. With the growth of fossil fuels, I absolutely want to degrow this very toxic agribusiness industry. The food industry is full of ultra-processed foods. There are basically poisoning us every day. So why not degrow that so we can have access to better food? And then guess what? This is going to reduce the cost of the public healthcare system because people won't get as sick anymore. So when we look into the math, when the little missing pieces, the metaphor I used to talk about selective degrowth is a game of Tetris. A game of Tetris, if you're just letting all the pieces fall, and they're out of place, they're not coordinated, they're just going to keep piling up, and then you're going to reach the top, you're going to go over the planetary boundary, and you lose. Game over. But if you're actually thinking about putting each piece in the proper place over here, you cancel out a line, and then you're able to keep going. And this is a kind of way of thinking that I want to think about degrowth, of making sure that we're under the limit, but we're actually matching our needs in every little piece of the game here.
No, I completely agree with Sabrina. The one thing that maybe I'll add to that question is, in terms of the tactic, I'm slightly uncomfortable with all the words that start with D, right? And I think degrowth, but that includes decarbonization, actually, because in terms of what you're telling people, it's something that they have to just, it has a negative, there is a negative outlook on it in terms of you're doing something bad and you need to just reduce it, as opposed to shedding attention on the aspirational life, right? And that's why I really like how you use those immunology metaphors in cancer, because the point is about being healthy, right? And people want to be healthy, right? And it's not just about degrowing the cancer, but it's about the bigger purpose of being healthy. And same with decarbonization. We often use it, people associate it, with a burden, when, from a tactical point of view, from a communication point of view, we should be talking perhaps about energy elevation, right? Or ecological maximization. And that kind of, in the discourse, I think the narrative, it's perhaps more palatable to people to associate it with. But I completely agree with that point on what is to be degrown. And this is what has happened throughout history, right? And this is not just on the ecological side. Same with, how economies have always functioned in terms of degrowing least productive activities to let the more productive activities, take over. Same with innovation, right? So this is part of the process.
Yeah, I think many degrowthers, and I'm not one of them per se, I use other frameworks, but I'm very sympathetic to the ideas of degrowth. But many degrowthers say that degrowth has a bad name, like it does not convey a kind of a positive, flourishing, vision that you want. But at a fundamental level, the idea is simple and make a lot of sense. You degrow the socially unnecessary production and consumption, especially of the richest parts of the world and the richest amongst us. So we're not gonna degrow public services. In the contrary, we're gonna invest more in public services, public health, public education, public transportation, and so forth. But you're gonna limit or degrow all those socially unnecessary sectors in terms of luxury consumption by the rich, having yachts, having luxury products. All of these are not necessary for society. But at another level, we need to look also at the historical responsibility in causing the climate crisis. It's the global north. If we're gonna continue in the same way of producing and consuming things here in the West and expand that to all parts of the global south, we're gonna go beyond the planetary boundaries. We're gonna create more destruction. We're gonna create more sacrifice zones. And I think that's not the way forward. In terms of your question around the geopolitical tensions, I think we are clearly moving towards multipolarity. The US empire, even if it's still, dominating, it's, going downhill. And they are realizing that. That's why they want to reassert their power, to reassert their dominance and primacy in every sector. And they are launching all those economic wars. They want to contain China because China is really advanced in terms of those green value chains in those technologies. We are seeing now Trump even negotiating a deal with Ukraine so they can control their resources, their critical raw minerals. The same thing with Greenland, I believe. I think maybe that's why the move. So that context creates risks and dangers in terms of escalating wars, in terms of land grab and resource grabs, in terms of dispossessing people. But I believe it also creates opportunities for certain countries in the South to benefit from that kind of multipolarity. It's not a perfect world, it's not black or white, but that multipolarity creates room to maneuver. So I see, like, from the North African point of view, I would say, okay, if those big countries in the West refuse to give you technology and to give you the finances to finance your development model, to finance your green investments, maybe you can negotiate better with China. And it's not necessarily you're gonna win, but that creates some room to maneuver. And, it comes with its risks, but I feel there are threats and there are opportunities. And it's up, to those countries, if they are smart enough, up to the populations of those countries to use that moment in order to benefit and to use their own resources. For example, we've seen many countries in the south, like Indonesia, Zambia, put in an export ban on their critical raw materials. They are saying we're not going to export those resources in their raw form. We need to create value in our own country, like what the economists call it value addition, right? I learned that term like 2 years ago. But it's about creating more value, creating more industries in your own country, creating more jobs, and moving the value chain to break those chains of dependency. But again, that comes with its own risks. Maybe by using those resources, maybe you're gonna create also environmental destructions that needs to be taken into account. Maybe you're creating another dependency as well, because you need to export to those markets. And I think Amir Ledbioui has really explored these tensions and contradictions in his book, The Survival of the Greenest, looking at the opportunities and threats for developing countries in the South in terms of benefiting from the opportunity. But the last question is about hope. Even if, you can be pessimistic in the short term, I'm an eternal, optimist. Otherwise I wouldn't do that work. I believe in the power of people, the creativity of people, but as the well-worn quote of Gramsci, it's pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will for me.
Thank you, Hamza. Thank you, Amir. Thank you for being here, for your questions, commentary. We're closing our session right now. We invite you to visit the artwork in the exhibit. And this will also be available online later on if you want to revisit the conversation. Please pick up a piece of the dossier on your way out so you can check out the debates and the discussion from the comfort from your home. Thank you for being here and have a good night.